I wasn't looking for a mystery until the sidewalks started hiding windows. Every new archive seemed to reveal another elegant stone facade with its lowest floor swallowed by the ground, as though the city itself had been lifted while the buildings remained exactly where they had always stood. The first time I compared historic photographs with surviving streets, I assumed each example would have its own local story. In many cases, it did. Municipal records describe deliberate changes in street grades to improve drainage, install sewers, reduce flood damage, rebuild after devastating fires, and modernize transportation. Engineering reports, city council plans, preserved underground districts, and excavation photographs document those transformations in remarkable detail. For most people, that is where the story ends, but then the pattern repeated. Different countries, different decades, different disasters. Yet again and again, the same visual contradiction appeared. Buried entrances, hidden storefronts, and basement spaces that had once opened directly onto the street before later modifications changed everything around them. The official explanation may be correct, but it does not explain why these photographs feel so unsettling. Perhaps it is because they preserve a version of the city that vanished without leaving dramatic ruins, only forgotten floors beneath ordinary sidewalks. If entire generations walked above places that once stood in full daylight, how much of the old city are we still passing every day without realizing it? The deeper this investigation goes, the less dramatic the evidence becomes, and perhaps that is precisely why it is so compelling. There are no collapsed empires emerging from the ground, no forgotten civilization suddenly uncovered beneath a modern skyline. Instead, there are ordinary storefronts, elegant stone staircases, arched windows, and doorways that no longer lead anywhere because the street outside has quietly risen above them. Look carefully at the historic photographs. Notice the lower row of windows. Follow the carved stone lintels beneath the present sidewalk. In many cases, the decorative masonry continues below today's ground level without interruption, quietly revealing that what now appears to be a basement was once part of the building's public face. In one image, customers step directly into a shop from the sidewalk. Decades later, that same doorway survives only as a basement entrance. A row of tall windows, once filled with daylight, now sits below the pavement, partially blocked by soil and retaining walls. Even the worn stone threshold remains where countless footsteps once crossed from street to shop. Buildings that appear unchanged suddenly seem strangely compressed, as though someone removed their lowest visible chapter. But one detail refuses to fit. This transformation was not confined to a single city. It appears again and again across North America and Europe. Each example comes with its own documented explanation, yet the visual result remains remarkably similar. One of the clearest examples waits in Seattle. Before the Great Seattle Fire of 1889, the city's streets occupied a lower grade. After the fire, rebuilding became an opportunity to solve long-standing drainage problems. Streets were reconstructed several meters higher, while many existing masonry buildings remained standing. Rather than demolish every structure, builders adapted them to the new elevation. Former ground floors became lower levels. New entrances appeared above the old ones. What had once been street level slowly disappeared beneath the rebuilt city. Today, preserved sections of the Seattle Underground allow visitors to walk through spaces that were once ordinary sidewalks and storefronts exposed to daylight. Look closely at the brick arches overhead. Notice the iron hardware still attached to old storefronts. The architecture never expected to be underground. Only the street around it changed. The official explanation is thoroughly documented, yet seeing those spaces creates an unexpected feeling. They do not resemble mysterious ruins. They resemble familiar streets that someone quietly forgot. That is where the pattern begins. The accepted explanation deserves to be understood before any larger question is asked. During the 19th century, many rapidly expanding cities faced practical problems that modern observers rarely experience on the same scale. Roads became seas of mud after rain. Waste disposal systems struggled to keep pace with growing populations. Flooding repeatedly damaged commercial districts. New sewer networks required consistent gradients that older streets often could not provide. Transportation demanded smoother, more reliable routes. Raising street grades became an engineering solution. Instead of rebuilding entire cities from scratch, engineers often chose the more economical path. Existing buildings were modified while new streets gradually rose around them. Former first floors became basements. Staircases were reversed. Windows became ventilation openings. Entrances moved upward. Chicago offers one of the most extraordinary examples. Beginning in the 1850s and continuing into the 1870s, Chicago undertook one of the largest urban engineering efforts of its era. Streets were systematically elevated to improve drainage and public health. In many locations, buildings themselves were also raised or altered to match the changing grade. The project was neither secret nor accidental. It required planning, engineering, labor, and remarkable coordination. At one point, engineers successfully raised an entire row of masonry buildings along Lake Street at the same time, structures weighing an estimated 35,000 tons, while many businesses inside continued operating almost normally. Customers entered shops, workers remained at their jobs, and the city quietly lifted an entire block beneath them. Historic images reveal buildings standing temporarily above massive lifting equipment, while new foundations and street elevations were prepared around them. Notice the forest of screw jacks beneath the masonry walls. Compare the workers' height with the exposed foundations. What first appears impossible gradually becomes understandable once the scale comes into focus. This is where the official explanation becomes impressively complete. It explains why cities invested enormous resources into changing their elevations. It explains why older architectural features survive below today's sidewalks. It explains why so many 19th century basements contain unusually large windows, carved stone lintels, decorative brick arches, and substantial bronze or iron door hardware that seem strangely elaborate for spaces now hidden below street level. Engineering reports and municipal planning records describe these projects in practical language. There is little mystery in their stated purpose. But then I noticed something even stranger. The engineering was different in every city. The photographs were not. Again and again, buried entrances, lowered windows, and forgotten storefronts created almost the same visual impression, regardless of whether the cause had been fire, flooding, sanitation, or transportation. When modern viewers encounter these buried levels without first learning the history, their instinct is often the same. Why does this building appear to be sinking? The records answer that question. The building did not descend. The street rose. Understanding that fact resolves the engineering problem. But emotionally, the photographs continue to feel strangely inverted, as though familiar cities quietly exchanged one visible landscape for another. The strange part is not what survived. It is what disappeared from everyday view. If every buried entrance belonged to a single reconstruction project, curiosity might end there. Instead, similar scenes appear across cities separated by geography, politics, language, and circumstance. Sacramento provides another remarkable chapter. Repeated catastrophic flooding during the 19th century forced civic leaders to confront an uncomfortable reality. Large portions of downtown stood too low to remain safe during recurring floods. During the 1860s and 1870s, extensive efforts permanently raised significant sections of the city. Rather than erase every existing structure, many buildings were adapted. New street grades slowly climbed above earlier entrances. Former storefronts became underground spaces. Brick arches remained where pedestrians once walked in full daylight. Excavation photographs and preserved sections of historic Sacramento reveal this transition, with unusual clarity. Layers of urban history become physically visible. One city exists beneath another, not because of sudden catastrophe, but because practical engineering gradually transformed daily life. Look carefully at the surviving passageways. Notice how the brick arches continue uninterrupted. The worn stair treads descend toward what was once the sidewalk. Even the window proportions still belong to ordinary commercial buildings rather than storage basements. But one detail refuses to disappear. Walk through these preserved spaces today, and they rarely feel like basements designed to store coal or machinery. Many were originally commercial interiors. Their proportions make sense. Their windows make sense. Their decorative stonework makes sense. Only their relationship to the street has changed. That distinction matters. The engineering explanation does not diminish the mystery of perception. It simply redirects it. Instead of asking whether something impossible happened, we begin asking something quieter. How often does modernization hide its own past without intending to? Every raised sidewalk quietly edits the city's memory. Every relocated doorway changes how later generations understand the building before them. The records explain the construction. They do not fully explain the feeling. Stand on a present-day sidewalk above one of these forgotten floors, and it becomes surprisingly difficult to imagine ordinary life continuing several feet below your shoes only a century earlier. Merchants opened doors there. Children looked through those windows. Deliveries arrived at street level. The city functioned normally. Then the reference point changed. The architecture stayed. The ground moved upward. Once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Then another city showed exactly the same pattern, not because it shared Sacramento's floods, not because it experienced Seattle's fire, but because changing the streets often proved easier than rebuilding the city itself. That realization led away from individual case studies and toward something much broader. The investigation grows more interesting when photographs give way to maps. Among the most valuable tools for understanding these transformations are Sanborn fire insurance maps. Created to document buildings for insurance purposes, these detailed maps frequently recorded entrances, construction materials, floor arrangements, and changing street relationships in late 19th century American cities. For historians, architects, and preservation specialists, they provide a remarkable record of urban evolution. Compare different editions across time. A doorway appears on one version at street level. Later, documentation reflects a different entrance. The building has not vanished. Its relationship to the city has. But the maps revealed something the photographs could not. They recorded change while it was happening. What appears mysterious in a single photograph becomes understandable when successive editions quietly document streets rising, entrances moving, and buildings adapting one phase at a time. These maps help explain why many present-day basements once served as active commercial floors. They were never intended to be hidden. They became hidden because the surrounding streets gradually assumed new elevations. That is where the pattern expands. Historic photographs from Boston and New York reveal comparable visual contradictions. Elegant masonry buildings display partially buried windows. Stone lintels disappear below sidewalks. Original ventilation grills emerge from retaining walls. Decorative door surrounds survive beneath modern pavement. Staircases descend where they once climbed only a few steps. Again, each location has its own history. Again, there is no single cause. Again, engineering rather than mystery explains the practical decision. Yet, the repeated image remains almost identical. Then, the investigation accelerates. Seattle, Chicago, Sacramento, Boston, New York, London, Paris, Prague, Edinburgh, Antwerp, different languages, different governments, different engineers, different reasons, yet historic photographs from each city preserve familiar scenes, buried doorways, lower windows cut by modern sidewalks, retaining walls standing where open streets once existed, and elegant facades whose lowest architectural details quietly disappeared beneath later construction. Across the Atlantic, similar architectural traces appear in London, Paris, Prague, Antwerp, and Edinburgh during periods of 19th century modernization. Street grades shifted, infrastructure expanded, transportation evolved. Urban improvements altered the relationship between buildings and the streets surrounding them. Some entrances disappeared, others migrated upward. Retaining walls emerged where open sidewalks once existed. Original paving stones occasionally survive below newer street surfaces, while weathered masonry joints quietly mark where the earlier city once met the ground. The same visual language appears despite different municipal histories. This does not prove a shared hidden event. It demonstrates something equally fascinating. Cities facing different practical challenges often arrived at remarkably similar physical solutions. Historic photographs preserve those moments of transition. Look closely at the people standing in those images. They rarely seem to notice history unfolding around them. One photograph shows workers beside a newly elevated roadway. Another captures temporary wooden staircases connecting old and new street levels. Elsewhere, elegant facades appear split between two eras, their lower windows gradually surrendering to expanding pavement, while carved stonework continues below the sidewalk, almost unnoticed. The pattern repeats not because every city followed identical circumstances, but because rapid urban modernization frequently demanded difficult compromises. Still, one quiet question remains. How much architecture survives beneath our feet simply because rebuilding everything would have cost too much? The longer this investigation continues, the more it becomes a story about memory rather than construction. Cities are often imagined as permanent places. Stone suggests permanence. Brick suggests permanence. Grand civic buildings appear timeless, yet photographs tell another story. A city can change profoundly without moving a single landmark. Raise the streets, reverse the entrances, seal the lower windows, allow new generations to inherit only the upper portion of what once existed. The transformation becomes almost invisible. Historic comparison photographs reveal this subtle disappearance with startling clarity. Compare the first photograph with the second. The cornice remains unchanged. The brickwork aligns perfectly. Even the carved doorway survives. Only the sidewalk has climbed higher, quietly rewriting how the entire building is perceived. In one image, pedestrians gather outside storefronts at the original grade. In the modern view, the same decorative stonework survives beneath sidewalk level. Nothing dramatic collapsed. Nothing theatrical exploded. The visible city simply became shallower. This is where the emotional weight begins to emerge. When people speak about lost cities, they often imagine civilizations erased by time. But these forgotten floors belong to cities that never disappeared at all. Seattle continued growing. Chicago expanded into a global metropolis. Sacramento adapted and endured. London, Paris, Prague, Antwerp, and Edinburgh modernized while preserving much of their older architecture. The earlier city was not abandoned. It was incorporated, layer by layer, generation by generation. Sometimes preservation happened almost accidentally. Older masonry proved too valuable to demolish. Builders adapted instead. As a result, fragments of 19th century daily life remain physically embedded inside the modern city. A basement doorway may once have welcomed shoppers. A narrow window may once have displayed merchandise. An underground corridor may once have carried ordinary pedestrian traffic beneath open skies. Original thresholds remain polished by footsteps that ended generations ago. Iron door hinges still wait beside entrances that no longer face the street. But one detail refuses to fit comfortably into modern intuition. Most people expect history to lie far away, in distant ruins, isolated archaeological sites, or abandoned settlements reclaimed by nature. These forgotten floors challenge that expectation. History may instead exist beneath the busiest sidewalks in town, not hidden by secrecy, hidden by familiarity. Everyday life has a remarkable ability to conceal yesterday beneath today's routine. The strange part is not that cities changed, It is how completely those changes became normal. This is the point where caution becomes as important as curiosity. Buried architectural levels have inspired countless speculative explanations. Some suggest forgotten civilizations. Others imagine worldwide catastrophes or coordinated historical erasure. The surviving evidence presented here does not support those conclusions. The documented engineering history deserves to be taken seriously. Municipal engineering reports, redevelopment plans, excavation records, preserved underground districts, city planning documents, and Sanborn fire insurance maps consistently describe practical reasons for changing street elevations: flood protection, drainage, sanitation, transportation, recovery after destructive fires, economic adaptation. These explanations account for a great deal. Recognizing that does not diminish the visual power of the surviving architecture. Instead, it raises a different question. Why do these spaces continue to affect us so deeply? Perhaps because they reveal how fragile urban memory really is. A single generation witnesses a familiar street. The next generation inherits an altered version. By the third or fourth generation, the former landscape survives only in photographs, maps, engineering drawings, or an unexpected staircase descending beneath a modern storefront. An engineering report may explain why the street changed. A photograph quietly reveals what the report never intended to preserve. This is where the official explanation becomes incomplete. Not because it lacks evidence, but because engineering documents were never intended to describe human perception. They explain how streets were raised. They cannot fully explain why standing beside a buried doorway feels like encountering a conversation interrupted decades ago. Look closely at one of those entrances. The weathered stone threshold remains. The masonry joints continue uninterrupted below the pavement. The proportions still invite people inside. Only the street refuses to cooperate. Architecture remembers functions long after people forget them. An oversized basement window quietly hints that it was never designed as a basement. A sealed entrance suggests previous movement through space. Stone steps, ending beneath pavement, invite questions without demanding impossible answers. The mystery is not necessarily hidden history. The mystery may be how quickly visible history can disappear while remaining physically present. The city never erased these places completely. It simply stopped looking at them. That possibility is unsettling enough on its own. Return to the photographs one final time. Look beyond the dramatic engineering. Ignore the temptation to search for extraordinary explanations. Instead, study the ordinary details: a doorway, a window, a storefront, a staircase, the worn edge of a stone step, the iron handle mounted lower than it should be, the buried window frame catching light from a narrow opening beside the sidewalk. Imagine the people who crossed those thresholds when they stood level with the street. They did not know future generations would someday call those spaces basements. They simply walked through the front door. Seattle rebuilt after fire. Sacramento adapted to repeated flooding. Chicago transformed itself through one of history's largest urban engineering projects. Across American cities, Sanborn fire insurance maps quietly preserved changing relationships between streets and buildings. Across London, Paris, Prague, Antwerp, and Edinburgh, modernization altered grades, entrances, and public space according to local needs and documented circumstances. None of these examples require hidden empires or forgotten continents. Reality is already remarkable. Cities literally change their own ground beneath people's feet. They buried portions of themselves not to hide history, but to solve immediate problems. And yet the result carries an unexpected emotional consequence. Modern pedestrians often move through landscapes where yesterday still exists only a few feet below. Former storefronts remain behind retaining walls. Old entrances sleep beneath sidewalks. Windows that once welcomed daylight now collect shadows. The official explanation tells us why these transformations happened. The surviving architecture reminds us what they cost. Not in mystery, not in conspiracy, but in memory. The streets changed, the buildings adapted, the photographs endured, the maps kept their quiet record. The stone remembered. The city moved on. Perhaps that is why these photographs remain so difficult to forget. They reveal that cities do not always destroy their past. Sometimes they simply build over it, continue living, and allow ordinary routines to conceal extraordinary layers of everyday history. So, the next time you notice an unusually deep basement window, a staircase descending below the sidewalk, or a decorative doorway leading into what appears to be a cellar, pause for a moment. Ask yourself a simple question. Was this always underground? Or are you looking at a room that once stood exactly where the street used to be? The records may answer how the ground changed. The photographs may show when it happened. But the quieter mystery remains unresolved. How many forgotten streets still survive beneath the ones we walk every day, waiting not to be discovered, but simply to be noticed?